Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're here for our Meet the Specialist program. We are very pleased to be hosting Nancy Bettinger, who's our legislative specialist for criminal legal system bills. And you will see her tremendous expertise in this area. So she is our inaugural Meet the Specialist tonight. My name's Jen Miroff. I'm the chair of the Legislative Action Committee. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. Nancy, I'm going to spotlight you and then I'll share your slides. Okay, can you see them?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for being here tonight. As Jen said, I work on criminal legal system reform for the League's Legislative Action Committee, and I'm going to talk about the sentence of life without possibility of parole tonight, and the bill we're supporting to end those extreme sentences. But first, I have to give you a bit of background on the League's Legislative Action Committee. Next. The committee comprises 22 volunteer specialists who conduct advocacy work. We select and monitor about 150 bills in 20 broad policy areas for each 2-year legislative session. We submit written testimony and in many cases present oral testimony during committee hearings. We suggest advocacy actions that local leagues and members can take and organize educational events. Our work is guided by LWVMA's program priorities that are set at our convention. Next. In deciding which bills to support, we consider whether the League has adopted policy positions that support the bill, whether the bill has broad policy implications for the Commonwealth, whether there's strong support from coalition partners, and finally, whether it's likely to pass. In the legal system area, there's an additional consideration. We want to focus on bills that are priorities of people who are involved in the legal system or who have been involved in the legal system. And we do that by following the lead of coalition members who have close connections with people who are involved in the system. The main coalition that we work with related to this bill is the Campaign to Eliminate Life Without Parole, or CELWAP. Next. These are the topics I'm going to touch on. First, I'm going to summarize the bill that we're supporting to eliminate life without parole. Then I'm going to talk about why Massachusetts life without parole is not normal. And after that, how this sentence was different in the Commonwealth in the 1970s, and then the steep rise in those sentences after the 1970s and what might have been responsible for that. And finally, what we can do about it. Next. Altogether, we have identified 6 legal system reform bills as League priorities this session, and they are listed in the last slide of this slide deck, which we'll send out to you afterwards. The bill we're supporting to eliminate life without parole is called an Act to Reduce Mass Incarceration. It's sponsored by Senator Miranda and Rep. Worrell, and the bill would give every incarcerated individual the opportunity for a parole hearing after serving 25 years of their sentence, including those who have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. It would also require the Department of Correction to establish a restorative justice program. We're also supporting a second bill that would effectively eliminate life without parole, and that's called an act relative to parole for aging incarcerated people. But that bill would only come into play later in an incarcerated person's life after they're 55. But similar to the first one, it would allow everyone to seek parole after they're 55 and have served a minimum amount of time. Next. So these bills would only give people opportunity for a parole hearing and to make their case before the parole board. They don't promise parole to anyone. Some people would still spend the rest of their lives in prison, but it would be many fewer people. Next. The League of Women Voters policy positions support a focus on humane treatment and rehabilitation with a goal of promoting successful reentry into communities of those who have been incarcerated. We also support measures to protect the civil and individual rights of the offender and to promote the person's rehabilitation through individualized treatment. Next. So just so everyone knows, life without parole is the sentence for first-degree murder, and life with parole is for second-degree murder. But first does not necessarily mean worst. For example, life without the possibility of parole can be imposed just for participating in a crime in which someone's killed, even if someone else committed the murder. Next. By using life without parole so extensively, we're doing a lot of harm. We're condemning a huge number of people to die in prison. 1,000 people in Massachusetts are serving this sentence right now. We're denying that people can change. We're depriving people of hope, wasting human potential, punishing innocent children and families, and damaging communities, especially BIPOC communities, ignoring the evidence that these sentences provide no significant public safety benefit, but have enormous social and economic costs, and holding too many elders in prison. I only want to expand on the second bullet a little bit, the idea of people changing. I think that most of us in everyday life, including me, are skeptical about whether people really change or not. But what I've learned is that prison is different. Landing in prison can be a real shock for a person, especially for young people. And it often leads people to think very long and hard about their actions and who they want to be and find ways to redeem themselves and contribute to their community, at least on the inside. So many people actually do change profoundly in prison. So life without parole is considered an extremely severe and cruel sentence, not only by reform advocates like me, but by academics and legal professionals and other professionals. Next. So who is responsible for all this harm? Well, we all are, really, because we're supporting this system through our votes and our elected officials, our taxes. None of us wants to think we're cruel, but we're supporting the cruel system. And I think, for those of us who personally don't know anyone who's incarcerated or ever been incarcerated, it's not easy to be well informed about the correctional system. In many ways, the system is really designed to keep people on the inside, out of sight and out of mind of the public. But since we're supporting this system, I feel that we owe it to people on the inside not to forget about them and to be mindful of the human costs of confiscating people's lives. And for those of us who are active around governance, to do what we can to change it. Next. Providing a hearing for everyone would provide incentives to actively pursue self-improvement programs, to begin to address the atrocious racial disparities among those serving life without parole, to give people incentives to follow the rules and regulations, and in doing that, it would make prisons safer for both corrections officers and people who are incarcerated. It would also give their families hope. Next. For a true understanding of what LWOP means to people who are enduring it, I would strongly encourage all of you to listen to the powerful testimony by people currently serving this sentence in various Massachusetts facilities. The testimony was offered at the July 25th Joint Judiciary Committee hearing. And the slide has a link to the entire hearing, and it gives a time frame where you can find the testimony from people who are incarcerated. Enabling incarcerated people to testify via Zoom at this hearing was a huge breakthrough. I think it was the first time that they could testify for this committee. And I just want to say kudos to Prisoners Legal Services, who did a lot of the hard work of organizing it on very short notice, and also to the incarcerated people who worked very hard on their testimony. And I also want to say that I appreciate the legislators and their aides at the DOC and the DOC employees who did help to facilitate the testimony. Next. One thing I'd like you to take away from this is that the way we're using life without parole sentences in Massachusetts is not normal. It's not normal from a historical perspective, which I'll say a little bit more about later. It's not normal for New England, and it's out of step with international human rights standards for the treatment of prisoners. Next. Oh, next, Jen, sorry. We have the highest number of people serving life without parole sentences of any New England state, and even higher than our neighbor, New York. For example, as of 2021, per capita, we had 7 times as many people as Connecticut and 10 times as many people as New York, even though both had higher crime rates. Next. So I decided to include information about international human rights norms because I believe that most of us really do care about our human rights standing in the world, even though it appears to me that both US and Massachusetts courts and legislators seem to be indifferent about this. As far as established principles for the treatment of prisoners, we are out of sync with both the philosophy and the practices. Human dignity is a central tenet of human rights standards, although here in the United States, we rarely even hear people use the term. And as far as personal development, it's not prioritized in our system. People serving life without parole have precious few opportunities to benefit from self-improvement programs. And the possibility of reintegrating into society is completely foreclosed to them. Next. The one major human rights treaty that we have ratified, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, states that the essential aim of the penitentiary system is rehabilitation. But when we ratified the treaty in 1992, we added language as an understanding that punishment and deterrence are legitimate objectives. And that language just basically negates the clear intent of the original treaty language. So the bottom line is that our punitive sentencing practices are beyond the pale with respect to international human rights standards. Next slide. To top it off, in 2022, the Canadian Supreme Court unanimously ruled that life without parole was cruel and therefore unconstitutional, and they abolished it in Canada. Next slide. It wasn't always like this in Massachusetts, which means it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to stay like this. Next. As far as beliefs about the main purpose of prison, there have always been tensions between the goals of punishment on one hand and rehabilitation on the other, with different principles and values playing into each. But what changes over time is which one dominates. Right now, punishment is our priority in our correction system, with very long punitive sentences. Next. Excuse me, water break. But it wasn't always like this in Massachusetts. Up until the 1970s, many fewer people were serving life without parole in Massachusetts. And life without parole actually did not mean life without parole as it does now. Back then, people had a reasonable expectation of clemency and that they would not necessarily die in prison. The prison environment was more rehabilitation oriented, and indeterminate sentences, those are sentences without defined lengths, were preferred because they allowed officials to individualize sentences and focus on rehabilitation, at least in principle. The prevailing philosophy was that the main purpose of prison was rehabilitation. Next. To understand the reasons for our current reliance on these harsh sentences are not good, I think it's helpful to understand how we got here from where we were in the 1970s. Next. In the 1960s and 70s, opinions about how crime should be addressed were divided. On the one hand, several national commissions that studied the issue recommended social programs to address poverty and racial inequality as the root causes of violence. On the other, civil disorder, the civil rights movement, and rising crime led to public fear of crime and support for tougher sanctions. And there were plenty of politicians at that time using crime to appeal to racial anxieties. And that political environment led to changes in law enforcement that drastically increased the severity of punishments, despite the recommendations of experts. Next. So, dovetailing with the tough on crime politics, beginning in the 1970s, many states, including Massachusetts, transitioned to determinate sentencing, sentences of a definite length. Indeterminate sentencing was criticized by both the left and the right for lacking fairness, transparency, proportionality, and predictability. But the two factions had different goals. The left wanted less harsh sentencing, and the right wanted more harsh sentencing. As things turned out, though, determinate sentencing just provided fertile ground for more severe sentences because it coincided with tough on crime politics. Next. So Massachusetts political climate turned toward tough on crime along with the rest of the country after the 1970s. From 1977 to 2009, the number of people serving life without parole sentences in Massachusetts rose fivefold, from 170 people to 938 people. That number reached 1,000 a couple of years later, and it's been fluctuating around 1,000 ever since. A number of factors probably contributed to the increase in life without parole sentences, but it appears that decisions about arrests and prosecution and sentencing that are made in our tough on crime political environment are the likely drivers. Next. So in any debate on eliminating the sentence of life without parole, the death penalty is part of the conversation. Some people see life without parole sentences as a bulwark against the return of the death penalty. After the Supreme Judicial Court ruled capital punishment unconstitutional in Massachusetts in 1984, there were several unsuccessful attempts, fortunately unsuccessful, attempts in the legislature to reinstate the death penalty in Massachusetts. And the last effort was in 2007. And in those debates, death penalty opponents argued that life without parole was a better alternative. And that argument held sway. But by the numbers, abolition of the death penalty doesn't come anywhere near accounting for the increase in life without parole sentences. Life without parole is applied much more extensively than the death penalty ever was. And in my own personal opinion, this is a false choice between both of these sentences are horrible, and we shouldn't have to choose one of them. Next. Extremely severe sentencing has been really enabled by public indifference to an extent. The quotes on this slide from researchers show that drastic changes in laws, policies, and practices were not rooted in evidence-based principles or overarching penal theories. Policymakers have adopted and normalized excessively punitive sentences without any real public debate or objection, and current practices have been enabled by uncritical acceptance. For sure, there are a lot of people who are intent on making sure that sentencing is as severe as possible. But there are also a lot of people who simply are unaware of what we're doing in our criminal legal system. And this goes back to my earlier point that that we all need to be more aware of what we're buying with our tax dollars and take responsibility for it. So that's the end of the content. Next, Jen. So the next question is, what can the League do now? Well, as always, the League can provide testimony in committee hearings, and we did that in July. League of Women Voters envoys can contact legislators on behalf of their local league. And if the legislature is a committee member, a member of the Judiciary Committee, urge them to support the bill and report it favorably. And if not, urge their legislature to ask colleagues on the committee to support the bill. And then if and when this bill is sent for a floor vote, we will send out an action alert asking everyone to contact their legislators. Next slide. This just shows the members of the Judiciary Committee so that you can tell whether your legislators are on the committee. Next slide. And then what can you do as an individual? These first parts really mirror what I said about league members. As an individual league member, you can contact your legislator, and if they're a member of the Judiciary Committee, ask them to support the bill, and if they're not, ask them to urge their colleagues to support it. Another point here, though, is that there's another bill, and it's called an Act for a Second Look, and we aren't supporting it just basically because of timing and bandwidth. But so we aren't supporting it formally, but this is a bill that a lot of people in this space really care about. And it would allow people 25 years or younger who are incarcerated to petition their sentence to the judge who sentenced them originally for a reduction in the sentence. And this is a lot of people who are incarcerated feel that this would really benefit them and really hope that it gets a lot of support. And finally, you can attend, show your support by attending this event Where There's People, There's Power. It's on September 20th at the State House. And Cynthia, who's on, actually did almost all of the organizing from the standpoint of CELWAP. Thank you, Cynthia. I think it's going to be a great event, and I hope people are interested in attending it. So I think that's it. Next, I think is just